Good evening, everyone. On behalf of Axis Bank, I welcome you to the 12th edition of Treasury Market Talks. Axis Bank has been instrumental in serving a wide spectrum of customers through its innovative financial solutions and products, covering large and mid corporates, SMEs, agriculture, and retail businesses. The bank has leveraged the power of technology to provide uninterrupted, best in class service benefiting its wide customer base. We aim to equip clients with high quality input around emerging issues, and to this end, have emerged as a well respected thought leader within the banking industry. As part of its thought leadership initiatives, Axis Bank has been organizing Treasury Markets Talks, a talk series hosted by its corporate banking team on diverse topics such as central banking, fiscal policy, geopolitics, macroeconomics, and financial markets. We have been honored in the past by the presence of many eminent speakers as part of this initiative. Most recently, Professor Otmar Issing, who was the founding chief economist of the ECB, who spoke about inflation, Baroness Ashton, who was the former EU foreign policy chief who spoke about the Ukraine war, and Ila Patnaik, now principal advisor to the government of India, who spoke before the budget. Uh, the TMT has been very well received by all stakeholders with great enthusiasm and participation from leaders in the corporate world and the diverse fields. Today, we discuss the US midterm elections and are delighted to welcome back Todd Buckles, former White House economic advisor, renowned economist, and author, who provided actionable insight ahead of the US presidential election. Keeping announcement before we begin. Participation in the webinar is by invitation only. Axis Bank reserves the right to block access to any person to whom an invitation has not been sent. Unauthorized dissemination of the contents of this webinar is strictly prohibited, and prior explicit permission of Axis Bank is imperative. As a reminder, all participant viewing panels will be in the view only mode. Participants who wish to ask questions may post them on the question box on your screens. Please note that this conference is being recorded and may involve the presence of the press or media. On behalf of Axis Bank, I once again welcome all our customers to this event. I now hand over this forum to Brijesh. Thank you, and over to you.
Thank you, Tanay. Good evening and a very warm welcome to all of you joining us this evening for the 12th edition of Treasury Market Talks at Axis. My name is Brijesh. I head the Treasury sales business here at Axis, and we have with us, of course, Todd Buckles. As you know, he's been the former Director of Economy to the White House. He's also been the Managing Director at Tiger. He's authored so many books. I still remember Todd, The Price of Prosperity. I think it was a 2016 must read. And as Tanay mentioned, we've been lucky that this is the second time we've had Todd. The last time we heard Todd was during the 2020 presidential elections. Todd, if I still recollect, there were some amazing anecdotes. I think you were spot on quite a few things: policy, Biden, Kamala Harris, and her kind of lack of connect with Asia. So I think we're going to have an enjoyable session today. So Todd, our TMT sessions, they enjoy the patronage of both corporate and institutional customers. We have CXOs, treasurers, financial heads. So this is effectively the think tank of India, who's basically attending most of these calls. We also have a couple of funds logging in from Asia, Middle East, and UK. So first of all, Todd, thank you for joining us all the way from California at this early hour. Great to have you, Todd.
It's a pleasure to be with you, even at this early hour. Boy, it's so early here in California. I think Bill Clinton is still president of the United States. It seems like we're reversing in time. But, that was a more pleasant time in American politics. We'll get into that further. But a pleasure to be with you and your clients.
Thank you. Thank you, Todd. So we're here today to discuss the US midterm elections. The US midterm elections come spot in the middle of the presidential term. So 2 years after the US presidential elections and 2 years before the next US presidential elections. I think midterm elections help us get a feel of what's happening on the ground, what the people feel about the current administration. they also possibly give us a peek into the 2024 elections. So the midterm elections is all about the Senate and the House. The Senate has about 100 members. These are the senators. And the House has about 435 members. The Senate focuses more on national level issues, treaties, hiring of ambassadors, and the House is more about district level revenue bills and all of that. The Senate enjoys a tenure of about 6 years, with one third of them coming up for elections every 2 years, and the House has a 2 year tenure, with all of them coming up for elections. So this election and what we're going to be discussing today are the 435 House representatives which are coming up for election, and one third of the Senate, which is about 35 people coming up for election. So Todd, what's your take on what's happening on in ground zero? We're 40 days from election. What's the math of this election going to be look like? The swing states, the senators, the district representatives that could possibly swing it. It'll be great to hear from you, Todd, on what's actually happening there on the ground.
Yes. Well, these are confounding, confusing times economically, uh, financially, and now politically as well. I suppose the first thing to keep in mind, as you had stated, Bridge, these are what we call the midterm elections. The president is not on the ballot. The president is not up for re-election for another 2 years. However, it gives us some indication of his popularity. And this is a rather odd midterm election because, based on Joe Biden's low popularity, which is very low compared to other presidents, based on the rampant inflation, which is the highest that we've experienced in 40 years, based on the far embarrassing foreign policy failure of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which led the Taliban to be able to take American helicopters and missile systems. The Democratic Party, Joe Biden's party, should be in terrible, desperate shape. And in fact, historically, the party in power, the party that has the presidency, usually does badly during midterms, even if the president is modestly popular. So, on average, a midterm election would lead to the ruling party losing of the 435 seats in the lower house, the House of Representatives. The 435, typically, the president's party will lose about 24 seats, 27 seats to be more precise. And so the expectation would be, even if Joe Biden were modestly popular, the Democratic Party would be losing seats in the House and also in the Senate as well. What is rather remarkable this time around is that Joe Biden is far less popular than the average presidency. His support levels are around 41%. There have been a range of failures, certainly economically, that hurt the American people in their pocketbooks every single day. They have to pay more for food, pay more for petrol, and so on. And yet, the Democrats are unlikely to face a devastating loss, which would typically be expected when you combine the average throughout history for midterms plus the miserable inflation that we've been suffering. So I think what you're going to hear, and these are the discussions inside the White House, is to try to frame the expectations. Now, I've told you today that typically the incumbent party loses seats. I think you're going to hear the White House, not Joe Biden himself, but his advisors in the Democratic Party talk more about lowering expectations so they can say, hey, everybody knows we would have a bad season, but we actually did better, so therefore we must be more popular than the major media are proclaiming. Now, to be a little bit more specific, what's going on at the moment in the upper house, our Senate, which is, as Bridge correctly said, focuses more on national issues. Right now, it's rather even between Democrats and Republicans. Republicans of 100 seats hold 50. Democrats hold 48. Now, you might think, well, 50 to 48, so the Republicans have the majority or plurality, but there are two independents. And those two independents, one of whom is the famous Bernie Sanders, socialist, votes with the Democratic Party. So the Democrats have 48 full-fledged seats plus two independents. And the way the Senate works in the United States, the Vice President of the United States, in this case Kamala Harris, casts the tie-breaking vote. So essentially, when there is a deadlock vote in the Senate, it will go 50 to 50, and Kamala Harris, as vice president, will cast the deciding vote. So therefore, effectively, Democrats have a majority. We would expect in normal times, Republicans would pick up at least one seat. That's all they would need to change the calculus. And now, as a result of Donald Trump, and his behavior, not so much as president before the 2020 election, but after, the Republican ability to get a majority is imperiled. And it is a very close call. If we had to bet today, we would bet that Republicans will not be able to break that tie in the Senate. And in typical Donald Trump fashion, the Senate is now hinging on two, not politicians, but celebrities that Donald Trump has heartily endorsed. Those celebrities are running in the states of Georgia and Ohio. Ohio, let's take them one at a time. Ohio is generally a more Republican state. And there's an open seat in the state of Ohio. And the two people who are running for that vital Senate seat probably have little business in serving in the U.S. Senate. One of them, running on the Democratic side, is a local politician named John Fetterman. John Fetterman, even if he were of high intellect and great experience and great anything else you want to append to that, John Fetterman sadly, tragically suffered a stroke earlier this year. So the man who is representing the Democratic Party in the Ohio Senate race, who might be the linchpin for a Democratic majority, is actually incapable of debating and incapable of conducting a serious interview, objective interview, without committing various verbal, without stumbling in a very, stumbling in his verbal answers. I now am stumbling just trying to imagine John Fetterman in a debate. Again, it's tragic, it's sad. He looks hardy, he looks strong, but he cannot subject himself to an interview as I'm doing with Bridge today. Who is he facing? He is facing one of the most famous television celebrities in America. This television celebrity is named Mehmet Oz. Mehmet Oz is one of the most famous television doctors in American media history. He is friendly, he is affable, he is good looking. I've spent time with Mehmet Oz. He's a seemingly lovely fellow. He recommended, by the way, that I have more chia seeds with my breakfast. And Mehmet Oz has spent his career, well, actually, I should back up. Mehmet Oz began his career as a doctor in a very serious way. He taught cardiology at Columbia University, which is one of America's greatest universities. He's been a cardiac surgeon. His physician credentials are very, very strong. But over the course of the last 20 years, he spent most of his time on television. And during that time, he has promoted not just serious medicine, but a lot of nostrums, a lot of, circus what circus organizers used to call snake oil. And so if you Google Mehmet Oz, you'll find all sorts of products for dieting and hair loss and other sorts of things he may have endorsed that perhaps a serious doctor should not have endorsed. So added to that, Mehmet Oz does not really or hasn't spent much time living in Pennsylvania, the state where he is running for election. So John Fetterman's campaign has successfully portrayed Oz as A, not a Pennsylvanian, B, not honest because he will sell people anything, and 3, wealthy and therefore not typical. I have to apologize, my friends. I have continually said Ohio, and I had meant to say Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania and Ohio border each other. They share many economic features and economic history and political history. So it is Mehmet Oz and John Fetterman running in the state of Pennsylvania, not Ohio. I apologize for that. Ohio is also, from time to time, a swing state. So anyway, the state of Pennsylvania is crucial to the election. It is, and the two candidates are probably among the least popular, least qualified candidates running. The other state that Republicans should have control over is again in the hands of, for the Republican side, a celebrity who is, like Mehmet Oz, endorsed by Donald Trump. This celebrity's name is Herschel Walker. Herschel Walker was a famous American football player, one of the greatest college players in American football history, and an excellent National Football League star as well. He's strong, he's fit, he's good looking, he speaks well, and he's got a past that is very troubling for many voters. Of course, his opponent, the current senator of Georgia, a former reverend, or perhaps we should say current reverend in the church, also has some issues. His name is Warnock. I've actually spent time with Warnock. I wish I'd spent time with Herschel Walker when he was a football player. Herschel Walker, this is just some inside story. Herschel Walker and Donald Trump go back for decades. When Herschel Walker graduated from college and he was going to enter the National Football League and immediately become one of its biggest stars, Donald Trump at that moment was challenging the National Football League, just as he challenged the Democratic and Republican parties. And he created a new football league, a competitor to the National Football League. And the first thing Donald Trump did was throw money at young Herschel Walker, who at the time may have been 21, 22 years old, and bribed him, not in an illegal way. He paid him legitimately to join his new league. And so years ago, Herschel Walker put his future in the hands of Donald Trump. So Donald Trump has heartily endorsed Herschel Walker. Herschel Walker is an African American, as is his opponent, Senator Warnock. And Herschel Walker had been very effective in speaking on behalf of Donald Trump as a black man in America. The problem is that Herschel Walker's past has many moments in his past that he is not proud of. He has campaigned as a family man, but it turns out he had to admit to having some illegitimate children. He campaigns as a family man, and one of his sons just last week released a video where he condemned his own father and said his father had been violent towards the family and had not supported some children in the family. Now it turns out that Senator Warnock, Herschel Walker's opponent also has some issues with, I believe, an ex-wife who has accused him of violence. So these two states, which Republicans could win if they had boring candidates, instead, there is a 50-50 chance, maybe 52% chance they're going to lose because they have exciting celebrity candidates that have been promoted by Donald Trump. Bridge, I feel as if I should pause for a moment before I go on to talk about the House, in case you want to ask a follow-up on what I've just mentioned about those two critical states in the Senate.
No, so this, like I said, I think you've clearly helped us with this. That obviously there are so many states, and sitting back here, it's hard for most of us to figure out what is it that we really need to follow. So I think this conversation that we had about Herschel and then Pennsylvania will help us kind of narrow things down. But I'd like to extend this conversation onto the issues. And sitting back here in India, we do hear about we the biggest the case where the Supreme Court has reversed the ruling on Roe versus Wade. Now, this was typically, I would have thought, a Republican win, but I'm pretty sure there must be some women voter base that the Republicans would possibly lose on account of this. We hear a lot about. I believe there have been in excess of 500 shootings, that have happened in the U.S. So gun control is again, another hot topic. We recently heard about the tragic Texas school shootouts. So and nothing much has been done about that. So I would think that this is again something that could possibly go against the Republicans. Similarly, from the Democrat side, post Trump, once Biden's come in, Biden's border patrol and immigration rules have been fairly soft. I mean, you had Trump who wanted to build a wall. So I do hear some chatter about Democrats not being so happy about immigration. And like you correctly mentioned, inflation is such a raging issue. And, the incumbent, whether it's a Democrat or Republicans, I'm sure both are hurting. So apart from these, we hear about, topics like climate change and crime rates. And of course, there are district level issues, which probably would be a little far for us to connect with. But it would help, Todd, if you can give us a little flavor on, the issues that could kind of swing the election as well.
Yes. Let me do that. Let me just quickly talk about the lower house, the House of Representatives, because I had mentioned the upper house, which is more or less a tie at the moment. And if you had to bet today, you'd probably say the Democrats hold on to their kind of tie-breaking regime. In the House, the Republicans are likely to take over the House of Representatives. Right now, the Democrats have the House is basically 220 something to 212. And so Republicans will likely pick up enough seats to control the House of Representatives, which gives us more what we call divided government. In terms of the issues, you're right, Bridge. The Republicans. Well, let's start this way. One issue that you hadn't mentioned, you mentioned gun control, but the two biggest issues for the American people today, which should serve Republicans, are inflation, which we can get into as we discuss the economy more, but also crime, violent crime. And by this, the American people, as tragically, as horrified as we are by school shootings, it really is the violent crime on the streets in major cities that has become alarming. The city of San Francisco's reputation has been totally shredded by concerns about safety. And crime generally is an issue where the American people trust Republicans more than Democrats. This goes back to Richard Nixon, ran on a platform of, quote, law and order. And when we look at the cities in America where crime has been rampant, when we look at Chicago and look at St. Louis and look at San Francisco, almost all major American cities are controlled by the Democratic Party. So they are seen as having failed on crime. Immigration, as you, Bridge, you correctly point out, Donald Trump had taken a tough line on immigration. And currently, the borders look to many American people as if they're absolutely open. And even if they're not open, there's a clear signal from Joe Biden that refugees and any immigrant who wants to come to the US should come because now is the time because Joe Biden is president. And that too, immigration is a Republican issue. Now, what's quite fascinating in the last couple of years has been a change in the views of Hispanic Americans towards immigration. Up until recently, it was the conventional wisdom that 99% of Hispanic Americans wanted borders to be more open so that more Hispanic Americans could come to the States. And therefore, it seemed, and I'm exaggerating, of course, 99% of Hispanic Americans, other than maybe Cubans in Florida, would vote for Democrats. But in a fascinating way, we are seeing more Hispanic Americans in Texas on the border voting Republican. Not a majority yet, but electing some local officials. And now the Democratic Party in states like Texas are concerned that they are going to be losing Hispanic voters to the Republican Party. Having said that, the Biden administration has proved absolutely incompetent at handling immigration issues. And Kamala Harris, who was designated or deputized by Joe Biden to handle immigration or to devise a new strategy, has been almost absent in doing so. So we talk about crime should favor Republicans, immigration should favor Republicans. So and inflation should favor Republicans. So what's gone wrong for Republicans? Well, Bridge, you point out the abortion issue. Um, the Supreme Court overturned in the Dobbs case Roe versus Wade. And Roe versus Wade essentially meant that women, at least for the first trimester of pregnancy, would have the freedom to abort a fetus. And then it becomes a little bit more complicated beyond that. What the Supreme Court did, and some media totally misconstrue what the Supreme Court did. The Supreme Court did not ban abortion. What the Supreme Court said was that the U.S. Constitution does not speak about abortion, and the Supreme Court should not rule on the right to an abortion, but instead it should be determined by each of the 50 states. So what you find now is that some of the 50 states are legislating a complete freedom for abortion. Other states are restricting abortion. And so we will have 50 slightly different regimes, some of which may be quite different. But it wasn't a ban on abortion, it was returning it to the states. However, a majority of women do believe in the right to abortion. And this decision has given new life and new money to the Democratic Party as contributions have been made, especially to fight the fight on each of the state levels. So Republicans, in a sense, who tend to be anti-abortion, won in the Supreme Court victory, but there's been a backlash that has undermined their election chances. So that's one issue. You might also, or I might also suggest that the fight in Ukraine has helped Joe Biden by distracting attention from the domestic economy. The astounding bravery of the Ukrainian people and the magnificent leadership of Mr. Zelensky of Ukraine has certainly impressed the American people and other people around the world. And of course, it has shown Vladimir Putin to be a rather nefarious character. And that has been that was for the first, up until a few months ago, a fairly big distracting away from the domestic troubles in the United States. And to be fair, Joe Biden, I said earlier, had, I think, in a very embarrassing way, pulled out of Afghanistan, and a totally incompetent way had done so. But the administration has supported Ukraine and has not committed any embarrassing flaws on that aspect of foreign policy. And as we see Ukraine clawing back and taking back from Russia lost land, the administration can't say we did that, but the administration can say, well, our team does seem to be winning. So that helps the administration. The other thing that's helped the administration has been the continuing focus on Donald Trump. The hearings that have been held to investigate the January 6th matters, the lawsuits that Donald Trump and his allies first propagated, suing the ballot companies, but now everything's turned around. Now Donald Trump finds himself a defendant in court. The company, I actually had lunch a couple days ago with one of the individuals representing the company that makes the physical ballot boxes, the computers. And they are, of course, in a lawsuit suing Donald Trump, suing Fox News reporters and others. And so this continuing focus on the last election of 2020 and Donald Trump actually drains support from the Republican Party and makes it very difficult for the Republican Party and its supporters to look forward to 2024. So I hope that's helpful in understanding some of those issues.
No, absolutely. I think what was good is, you clarified obviously on some of the issues, and, we're obviously picking up what we hear on the news. So I think you did give us a slightly different view on the similar issue, on the same issues, and we were looking at it from one side. And you're right. What's happening on geopolitics and Ukraine, it is distracting, and it sometimes does serve the existing incumbent president well. But I will touch upon geopolitics in a bit. So just to wrap up the the midterm election core question, a quick one, Todd. Any thoughts from you on if you had a bet, which way would this go? Do you think you'd have the Republicans, effectively take both the House and the Senate? And the second part of the same question is, how do you see this segueing into the 2024 election? Do you see Trump throwing his hat back in, or any other cut to the 24 presidential elections?
Yes. So if I had to bet today, I would bet that Republicans take over the House. I feel relatively confident about that. It's an extremely close call in the Senate. I have to say, most reporters most reporters and analysts at the moment will tell you that the Democrats have about a 60% chance of retaining the Senate. I think that might be a little bit too high. I think the Pennsylvania race, and I mentioned Mehmet Oz, the celebrity doctor, versus John Fetterman, the local politician and stroke victim. I think that race is becoming a little bit closer and better for Mehmet Oz. So I think that the odds are, I'm not brave enough to tell you I think Republicans are going to take the Senate, but I think the market belief, the market average of 60% chance the Democrats win, I think that's too high. And I would not be surprised if Mehmet Oz wins that race. Herschel Walker, the embarrassing personal news, is coming at the worst time. It just came out a couple of days ago. And there's not a great deal of time between now and the election for Herschel Walker to argue that those were fabrications. Oh, and I'm sorry, I mentioned one of the other problems of Herschel Walker. It wasn't just a matter of accusations of violence. a woman this week who says she was an ex-girlfriend of Herschel Walker came forward and said Herschel Walker got her pregnant some years ago, and Herschel Walker paid for her abortion. And then she showed a check from Herschel Walker that she claimed paid for the abortion. So here you have a Republican who has spoken against abortion, and now apparently ex-girlfriend who is claiming that he would have fathered an illegitimate child, and the only reason he didn't father the illegitimate child is because he wanted the woman to have an abortion. So that just was revealed a couple days ago. Perhaps it's not true, but it's hard for Herschel Walker to argue against. So the answer to your question is I would not be surprised if Mehmet Oz pulls out the race, and that gives Republicans a majority of one in the Senate. I think the market is a little optimistic on the Democratic side, but who knows what new embarrassment could come. In terms of 2024, I think Donald Trump has to run again. I think his lawyers tell him he has to run again. And I'm sorry to be so cynical, but Donald Trump's best chance of not going to prison, or his family not going to jail, or his not being fined hundreds of millions of dollars as he's being prosecuted by by New York State and New York City, is to be insulated from it by possibly being president again. So I think Donald Trump is going to at least throw his hat in the ring, but he's not going to be willing to lose the Republican nomination. And what I mean is, I think he's going to say, I'm running again. But if he sees that his support is weak, I think he might have to concoct some excuse, whether it's health related with himself or his wife or his children, so that he doesn't have the embarrassing situation of not being the most popular Republican. But I think his inclination is to run, and I think it serves his ability to fight in the courts if he's somewhat insulated as an active politician. So who else would be running on the Republican side? Well, Donald Trump spends most of his time in the state of Florida. And some of you may have now heard many times the name of the governor of the state of Florida, whose name is Ron DeSantis. Ron DeSantis, in some ways, has, well, in Hollywood or on Broadway, perhaps Bollywood, we would use the term he's stolen his act. What is Donald Trump's act? Donald Trump's act is to be tough, not to be too polished, to be gruff, to sound like he'd be willing to fight you in a bar if he had to break every rule, and to break every piece of pottery in the kitchen. Well, Ron DeSantis, who is, like Donald Trump, an Ivy League graduate, a graduate of Harvard Law School, Ron DeSantis also comes across deliberately as a kind of tough guy. He doesn't sound polished. He doesn't sound like a guy who went to Harvard. He's not afraid to fight against big business. In fact, he was involved in a big dispute with the Disney company. He got angry because Disney was getting involved in the politics of education. So he withdrew benefits from Disney. And he's seen as a kind of, well, mini Donald Trump is not the right way to put it, but maybe a younger Donald Trump with a little less experience in television. Because I might remind the audience that Donald Trump, after becoming a very successful real estate mogul, and by the way, I might have mentioned on the last call, my family's known Donald Trump's family for a long time. My grandfather Sam, was in business with Donald Trump's father many years ago. But after that, Donald Trump spent a good decade or so on television, like Mehmet Oz, the celebrity doctor. Well, Ron DeSantis doesn't have that same experience. He's not as effective a showman as Donald Trump is. But anyway, he is a leading candidate if Trump does not win, and he, in fact, probably will challenge Donald Trump. Um, the next fellow on the list would be former Vice President Mike Pence. To be honest, I think many, even Republicans, find Mike Pence to be a little bland, that is not dynamic enough. He's a safer bet. He's unlikely to do anything crazy or to act in an embarrassing way. But I think he just is not a strong enough presence. Third on my list, who would perhaps be the most interesting character, is actually the Republican senator from Georgia named Tim Scott. Tim Scott is an African American. And to have a black man leading the Republican Party who has good conservative credentials, Tim Scott speaks very well, he's intelligent, he obviously can speak with authority about race relations in America, but from a Republican perspective. And he also understands Republican or conservative free market views on the economy. He's got a better sense of how the economy works, perhaps, than Donald Trump does. So keep an eye on Tim Scott. He's rather young compared to the others we've mentioned. Just a few other quickly on your Republican list. Glenn Youngkin is the new governor of Virginia. Virginia is often a swing state, but Youngkin, who was a private equity investor, won that race. He is an effective politician. He's highly intelligent. He's just really begun his term as governor. But to win in the state of Virginia, for a Republican to win the governorship in the state of Virginia, is a significant achievement and shows that he can win over moderates and win over women. And that would serve him well running as a Republican candidate for president. So those are some of the Republicans that we can discuss some more. But perhaps the most interesting question is whether Joe Biden is up to run for re-election.
Yes, on the Democratic side, that's the big one. And who's going to stand up? And I mean, people were discussing whether Biden's going to run through the whole term of his presidency. So
yes,
any flavor on that, Todd?
Yes. So Biden, right now, unless his health fails him, is going to run again. He feels, he's told people that he's strong enough. He still rides his bicycle and looks vigorous enough. Now, it's true that he stumbles verbally, and sometimes he looks as if he's lost in space. But he looked that way 2 years ago. It is hard to argue that his performance he began with such a low level of facility with words and a low level of alertness in his visage.
Right.
But it's hard to argue that that's degraded visibly.
Yes.
Basically, when he came into office, he looked like an old man who was sometimes lost.
I think he's gotten better. Yeah, he's gotten better for sure. He's gotten better.
So that's not the problem. Now, his popularity is very low because the economy has done poorly under him, and I don't blame him entirely. When we talk about the economy, I blame most of the inflation on the Federal Reserve Board. But the Biden administration, Joe Biden and his Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, completely misunderstood what was going on in the economy and have made things worse. He has, in the last 4 months, racked up a couple of victories that people thought would sort of reverse his low level of popularity, and they helped a little bit. For instance, there was some people call it the CHIP Act. There was a bipartisan Science Act that included $52 billion for semiconductor funding. And now we are seeing, and this actually began under Donald Trump, we see some U.S. firms, Intel, Micron Technology is going to be building a big fabrication plant in the state of New York, Intel in the Midwest. So we are seeing a kind of relocation of manufacturing in the States. And Joe Biden is taking credit for that. And I don't blame him. If I were president, I would take credit for anything positive that's happening.
So, Todd,
yes.
So I'm going to pause you for a minute, because what I'm going to do is, from what you just spoke, I'm actually going to, there are 2 points that I'd, like to flesh out for our audience. The first is, you did mention about, obviously inflation and what the Fed has been doing with aggressive rate hikes. So if you could kind of, you also wear an economist hat. So it would be great to hear your views on, inflation, what's happening, quantitative tightening, and the Fed is trying to induce a recession, and how's America going to take it? And the second part of the question is, you I was going to touch upon, the Chip and the Science Act, and I think in a way it is the opposite of globalization that's happening. You've seen more and more countries trying to be self-sufficient. So how do you see that play out? And it's kind of linked to the interest rate question, because we've seen with the rates going up, we've seen a stronger dollar emerge, and that's going to impact trade as well. So if you could kind of let us know what your views are on the economy, inflation, the rates, and then link to that the currency and trade supply.
Okay, let me do that. So we'll talk about inflation, trade, currency. I just mentioned that I don't blame Joe Biden entirely, or even a majority, for the inflation. But there was a total misunderstanding of the economy at the Federal Reserve Board, Jay Powell, and at the White House under Trump, but then also Biden, and it intensified. What do I mean by that? I have to confess to you, Bridge, I was a dove on inflation and supported the Fed's easy money policy for about how many years? 13 years. When Ben Bernanke was the head of the Federal Reserve Board, and the US and the world economy imploded in 2008-9 and the great financial crisis, I supported the super low interest rates that Bernanke established. Many of my friends, my Republican economist friends, condemned the Fed, and they said that Bernanke in 2009 and 10 was going to cause hyperinflation. And they said that in 2009 and 10 and 11 and 12. Then Janet Yellen took over as Federal Reserve Chair, and they said she was going to cause hyperinflation. They said she was going to make the US dollar fritter away, melt away to nothing because of the low interest rate policy. And I defended the Fed in 2013, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. There was no inflation. And in 20, I supported quantitative easing in order to fight COVID. But then the Fed went too far and misunderstood what COVID did to the economy. So I need to take a moment to explain this misunderstanding and how the Fed and how Joe Biden really destroyed the price profile of the US economy. It is commonly said that COVID caused a recession. I firmly argue that is the wrong word. It was not a recession. I call it a cessation. And there's a difference. And here's the difference that I want your audience to understand. In a recession, and we've had recessions before, every country has recessions from time to time. You can tell when there's a recession because you drive past an auto dealer and there are cars on the lot that are not sold. Too many cars. The dealer cannot get rid of the cars. They can't find buyers. There's too much inventory. You know there's a recession because you drive past a factory that makes washers and dryers and refrigerators, and you see them stacked up and you see boxes and pallets, and the factory is overflowing with inventory it can't get rid of because nobody wants to buy it. You see homes, new homes are built, and they're empty, too much inventory. That's a recession. A cessation is different. We stayed home. We stopped going out. We didn't go to the movies or to restaurants or to theater or on airplanes. Now, from a medical point of view, the cessation was far more deadly. In the States, we lost 1 million lives, and throughout the world, millions of lives. But from a purely economic point of view, it is easier to recover from a cessation than a recession. To recover from a recession, you have to wait for all of that inventory to finally be purchased by consumers, and then you call people back to the factories. In a cessation, all we needed was an effective vaccine. And now let me take you back to the critical mistake at the end of 2020. At the end of 2020, the US had its election and the vaccines began to roll out. No more stimulus was needed. The economy was bouncing back in a V-shaped manner. The Federal Reserve Board should have stopped the quantitative easing at that point. But what happened at the White House? In December of 2020, after Trump lost the election, he called in his advisors, Larry, my old friend Larry Kudlow, and he says, "Hey, Larry, what is that Biden guy going to do if we let him in here?" And Larry Kudlow, his chief advisor, said, "Well, Biden says he's going to send another another $500 billion out to the American people. He's going to send $1,500 to adults, $500." And Biden interrupted him. And Biden said, "Well, I'm not going to let him get the last word. I'm going to beat him to it. Before I leave here, I want to send out more than he's going to send out." So Donald Trump, look it up, December 27th, 2020, after losing the election, after the vaccines were starting to roll out, sent out $1 trillion of additional stimulus. Then Joe Biden comes into office, and Janet Yellen, his Treasury secretary, he calls her in and he says, "Janet, what do you think about, some people are talking about inflation." She said, "Oh, there's no inflation. Inflation isn't going to come. If it does come, it's going to be transitory." She was on team transitory, along with Jay Powell, the head of the Fed, and along with the famous Nobel Prize winning economist who writes for the New York Times that Democrats love to read, Paul Krugman, called himself on team transitory. So did my old friend Alan Blinder, former vice chair of the Fed, professor at Princeton, said he was on team transitory. So Biden asked Janet Yellen, "Janet, so exactly what did Trump do for his last stimulus?" She said, "Well, he sent out $1,500. Biden interrupted her and said, "Well, I'm going to double that. Whatever he did, let's do twice as much." In March of 2021, when the economy did not need more stimulus, Joe Biden and Congress agreed to $1.9 trillion of spending. So, forgive me for doing not serious math, but just a kind of flavor of mathematics here for you. The US economy, GDP, is about $30 trillion a year. Donald Trump, in December, sent out nearly $1 trillion. Joe Biden sent out an unnecessary $2 trillion. So between them, within about 3 months, you had $3 trillion of unnecessary spending on a $30 trillion economy. 3% on a $30 trillion economy. Are we surprised that we then have 10% inflation when you've added 10% to the flow into people's pockets? So the idea that it was transitory was a complete inflation would be transitory was a complete misreading. And so finally, this spring, Jay Powell stops the easing at the Fed. he begins finally to be raising interest rates, but it's only within the last couple of months that he realized and had admitted that the inflation was merely transitory. One other point on inflation, and it is because it is the absolutely most important issue in the election, I want to spend a little bit more time on it. For a long time, the excuse of team transitory was that it was just a supply chain disruption. That if we had just been able to get those container ships unloaded off the coast of Long Beach, California, and Los Angeles, that somehow the supply chain would be opened up and inflation would come down. Again, a complete misunderstanding, because that did not explain why the cost of renting an apartment was going up 15%, why the cost of going to university was going up 11%, why going to a dentist to have a tooth filling performed was going up 17%. Were those container ships off the coast of Los Angeles filled with English professors, dentists, and studio apartments? No. We have wholesale inflation across the board in services as well as goods, and that's been crippling in many ways. By the way, I wrote about this last December in the Wall Street Journal. I wrote a piece that was entitled Bread and Circuses, meaning bread, things, and circuses, services, would be the undoing of Joe Biden. So anyway, those have created enormous problems. In terms of trade, the consensus in Washington that was more or less in favor of free trade was ripped apart during the Trump years. Prior to Donald Trump, Republicans believed in free trade. Democrats were not enthusiastic about it, but they more or less would go along with trade. But Donald Trump shredded that idea. So now you've had trade skirmishes that have continued. When Donald Trump came into office, it was expected that he would put serious sanctions or tariffs on China because he seemed to dislike China, and on Mexico because he seemed to dislike Mexico. But it turned out the first victim of Donald Trump's trade policy was apparently, what he thought, our enemy to the north, Canada. The first tariffs that Trump put in place were against Canada. Well, some folks thought that when Joe Biden came into office, he would immediately start undoing Trump's trade policy. But in fact, Biden more or less kept Donald Trump's trade policy in place against China and against Canada. And the only place where he's wanted to loosen things is an area where I think he's wrong. He wants to open up sanctions against Iran. And, well, that's just my personal opinion on foreign policy. That's a mistake. But essentially, Joe Biden has been just as tough on trade policy because there's not support for open trade in the States. And in fact, there's wide applause for being able to induce companies to come back to the States, especially for manufacturing. Now, a bridge you wanted me to discuss.
So where do these?
Yes.
So the inflation, I think you've clarified that it was probably the excess which wasn't required that kind of spiraled inflation out. But we've seen aggressive Fed tightening, and with what you just mentioned on America kind of bringing manufacturing back home and all of that. What is the White House or what is the Biden administration's view on the dollar? We've never had the dollar so strong, and it's hurting a lot of countries. Thankfully, some countries like India, the central bank have navigated things fairly well compared to our peer nations. But a strong dollar is hurting a lot of countries. So what's the in-house view on a strong dollar?
Right. I think the White House is becoming increasingly concerned about the dollar. The one virtue of the stronger dollar, well, there are two virtues. First of all, it is a signal that the American economy, for all of its problems, might be in better shape than other countries. So Biden can see that as a bit of an endorsement though it is clearly from an economic point of view, the dollar, as strong as it is a hindrance to U.S. exports. And of course, for countries that are that have debt denominated in dollars, it makes it extremely difficult. But Biden can see that or interpret it as an endorsement of the U.S. economy. The other factor on the positive side of the strong dollar is that it does help contain inflation. And if the biggest fight we have going on now is the fight against inflation in the States, a stronger dollar means that foreign goods look cheaper to American consumers, so it helps constrain inflation. In the past, from time to time, when the dollar has been too strong, Treasury secretaries have tried to bring it down. In the early Clinton years, Lloyd Bentsen, the Treasury Secretary, had said, he only spoke verbally, that he would like to see the dollar weaker against the Japanese yen. And the dollar then began falling rather quickly. More coordinated action was done in the 1980s under the Reagan administration, when the dollar was last at this sort of level, and James Baker, the Treasury Secretary, who then went on to become Secretary of State, orchestrated with other finance ministers a weakening of the U.S. dollar. The problem now, as I see it, is that we don't, frankly, have the level of competence among finance ministers, and certainly among the U.S. Treasury. Now, I think Janet Yellen, as Federal Reserve Board chair, did a fine job. I think she was competent and intelligent, and I think she managed Federal Reserve policy in a very competent way during her tenure. However, the idea of orchestrating a change in the U.S. dollar requires an enormous amount of diplomacy and financial understanding at a time when Britain, for instance, has a new finance minister, a new prime minister, both of whom have how should we put it, have not performed in a way that induces confidence at this moment. So in order to orchestrate something to reduce the value of the dollar, you've got to have a lot of confidence in your own Treasury Secretary and in the counterparties. And the risk that something could go wrong, for instance, for the U.S. equity market, which appears now to have stabilized, it may not be worth taking that risk. And I think that's what the Biden administration feels at the moment, that they're able to point to a couple of the positives of the stronger dollar. It shows confidence, it helps fight inflation, and they're concerned if they do something very dramatic on the dollar, as James Baker did in the 1980s, they wouldn't be able to control how that could unravel.
Well, I think the fact that the strong dollar in some way endorses a strong government is something that is something that we all need to ponder on. You're right, and of course it does help to kind of wage a war on inflation when you have a strong currency. So
well, and Bridge, I have to. I know we want to go to your audience questions. I also need to point out something that I'd written about a couple of years ago in an article that you can find online called "The Dirty Secret of the U.S. Economy." Because you haven't asked me yet, or I haven't had a chance to tell you what I think is going to happen to the U.S. economy. I think inflation is beginning to turn more favorably. And we see that in worldwide commodity prices. It is vital that the U.S. inflation rate roll over by the end of this year, or else I think it could be quite dire for the equity market and for the economy, because that would mean Jay Powell at the Fed has to do much more. But what is the dirty secret? Because you brought up trade policy and currency policy. The dirty secret of the U.S. economy, which is not something that, when I taught at Harvard, I wasn't allowed to say this, but the U.S. economy is now so large in its GDP and apparently so resilient that it can grow at a reasonably quick pace, even if most of the rest of the world is not doing well. And we saw that actually during the Trump years, where the economy was growing at 3, 4, 5% GDP with no inflation. Meanwhile, Europe was on the cusp of a recession. Japan was on the cusp of a recession, and China was slowing down. So I think one reason the dollar is strong is there's an expectation that the US consumer will be able to handle this tightening, that the inflation news will finally improve by the beginning of 2023, and the US economy may very well get back up to a 3% growth pace. In fact, even though many people thought that we would be having a deep recession by the end of this year, it looks like the fourth quarter economy is most likely to have a positive number attached to it. So I thank you for allowing me to amplify a little bit on my earlier remarks.
No, Todd. In fact, as I told you, most of the audience here are, corporate treasurers and CFOs and CEOs. So I think, this was a very interesting conversation, and these insights have been exceedingly useful. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to request Tanay, who's there with me on the call, to see if we have any customer questions. I think we have time for about 4 or 5 questions, maybe 3 or 4 questions at least, Tanay. So, Tanay, do you have any questions that we could pick up?
Yes, we have multiple questions. It's difficult to pick a few of them, but I'll bring up a few good ones. So the first one is from Rasik Shah of Alliance Industries. It says, where does India fit into all of this? Uh, how do the midterm elections impact U.S. policy in India? How does U.S. both parties see India in terms of a partner, in terms of strategy, in terms of Asia? And how is India's foreign policy, which could be perceived as helping Russia and this time be viewed in the US? Uh,
Yes, those are very important questions. First of all, I do have to say, in terms of US domestic politics, one of the biggest failings of the Republican Party has been its inability and, frankly, apparent lack of interest in seeking out votes in the Asian community. And I mean among Indian Americans. I also mean among Chinese Americans and Vietnamese Americans and Japanese Americans. The Democratic Party has been the default party for Asian immigrants, even when those Asian immigrants have become enormously successful. There, there was one of the founders of neoconservatism was a man named Irving Kristol, who had started as a socialist and ended up being a conservative. His son became the chief of staff for Vice President Dan Quayle at the White House and has been a very prominent Republican pundit. But Irving Kristol was always lamenting the fact that Jewish Americans, even though they were earning more money than others, even though they had the profiles of Republicans, would still vote for Democrats. In fact, his line that used to be quoted, maybe not in polite company, he used to say that Jews earn like Episcopalians, but they vote like Puerto Ricans. Meaning, and he felt, well, as long as they're moving up the economic ladder, they should be voting more Republican. Well, the same could be said of Asian Americans whose incomes largely are higher than the median income for non-Asian Americans. And so that's one area, just our U.S. domestic politics, Republicans should be looking more closely. In terms of how India is perceived, the questioner is correct. When it comes to Ukraine, India is seen as obviously not being committed to the cause of Zelensky, but being rather in the middle, but in the middle between two parties, one of which Putin is seen by Americans as being quite evil and aggressive. Having said that, just to be blunt, the American people do not spend a lot of time thinking about the foreign policy of India unless there's a crisis. Now, I think the Biden administration, there was some tension a week or so ago when Mr. Jaishankar had criticized the White House for selling F-16 fighter jets to Pakistan. And Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, had explained that this is anti-terrorism. The Indian government obviously feels as if Pakistan is not to be trusted with those sorts of armaments. So, there has been that sort of tension. It's evident that the Bush administration, George W. Bush, had warmer relations. I think one of the reasons why the White House, and in fact the Democratic Party, is less positively looks less positively towards India is because Mr. Modi is seen as a quote strongman leader. And within many, the thinking of many folks in the Democratic Party, strongman leaders include Putin, include Modi, include Bolsonaro in Brazil, and include the most dastardly of all in their eyes, Donald Trump. And so I think, that is seen, Mr. Modi, regardless of, we can talk more objectively or analytically about his policies, but the Democratic Party feels that anyone who is put in the same category as Donald Trump, in any category, if he had the same golf score as Donald Trump, that would be a negative from the Democratic point of view. Now, when we look at India's foreign policy, aside from Ukraine, and look at it towards China, I mean, it's been a bit of a round trip in the sense that, from time to time there seems to be warmth, but then of course there was the clash in 2020, I think the summer of 2020, in the Galwan Valley that was fraught. But it does seem more recently that Mr. Modi is distancing himself from China, being willing to admit to relationships with the Dalai Lama, being willing to show sympathy for Muslim groups that are persecuted in China. So that then brings us to the issue, for instance, of the Quad in foreign policy. And clearly, the U.S. has become much more focused about China, and the agreement to provide nuclear submarines to Australia that really involved the UK and the US. I wouldn't say that undermined the Quad. Maybe it's, sidelines the Quad. One of the most interesting discussions I think we'll be hearing if Republicans win the Senate and if a Republican comes back to the White House is whether the Quad should actually have South Korea added to it. It does seem that, obviously, from an economic point of view, South Korea is one of the great powerhouses of Asia economically, and it is on literally the front lines of the battlefield against North Korea. So I think we probably will be hearing more about the Quad and perhaps expanding the Quad if Republicans become more powerful within Washington, D.C.
So what we're hearing from you is, obviously it's the Republicans who would have preferred, India in some sense, and we're not exactly in the best books with a democratic government. But yes, India does have its reasons, I think, to be standing middle ground. Tanay, in fact, Todd did touch upon 2-3 things which I was going to ask, but in case we have a couple of questions from customers on that, I'd love to bring in, US, China, and a bit on, if Todd could elaborate on the Quad versus probably the AUKUS as well, which is, now kind of taken center stage. So any questions, Tanay, from customers along those?
Yeah, you said it. So there are a couple which I'm going to combine. One of them is Srinivas Singaraju of Coromandel. So, Biden's popularity is linked to the price of gasoline. At least it has been seen moving together for the past few weeks and months. Is the move by OPEC Plus or Saudi Arabia, bang in the middle of the midterm election cycle, a geopolitical move? And also, how does as Brijesh mentioned, the Quad is almost gone to on the back burner of late, but the AUKUS is there. Japan is up. Germany's spending is up, and so on. So, how does the US see all of these things develop? So, the AUKUS, Japan, Europe, Germany, Asia, China, and the Middle East. What is the worldview developing out there?
Well, let's take those one at a time. First of all, the price of gasoline. I think the Biden administration has looked terrible in the last couple of days because the Biden administration had been sending all of its forces, I mean, Joe Biden himself, trying to persuade the Saudis and other members of OPEC not to cut back on production. And the fact that OPEC went ahead and did it anyway just shows a lack of influence in that part of the world, and that the American people are not following OPEC, but they are following the price of gasoline, and the price of gasoline in the States, which had been dipping, is now gradually clawing its way higher again, which is not good for obviously not good for consumers, but not good for the Democratic Party. There also is the feeling, and this is certainly what Republicans are campaigning on, and they're trying to sell this message that if it weren't for the policies of the Biden administration, we'd have much cheaper oil and gasoline. That the Biden administration, Democrats have prevented drilling, that they've dissuaded oil and gas companies from drilling, that they have threatened new taxes and therefore dissuaded new production. And at the same time, and this is what's so irritating to so many people, at the same time that the administration has tried to dampen production in the US, it has tried to replace that production by begging Venezuela and Saudi Arabia and others to produce more. So if we are worried about climate change and we're worried about pollution and we're worried about human rights, isn't it better to produce those fuels in countries that care about pollution, that care about the environment, and that care about human rights? I would far more trust with pollution and human rights the state of Ohio, the state of Pennsylvania, and the state of Oklahoma than I would the dictator in Venezuela. So there's hypocrisy that has crept into the policy. Now, the second question is very wide ranging, which is essentially, what do I think of various parts of the world? Here's one thing I will say. Vladimir Putin has not only destroyed cities in Ukraine and destroyed his own Russian army, he has also and he has also strengthened NATO. I mean, the exact opposite of what he wanted to do. He invaded Ukraine because he was concerned that Ukraine might someday join NATO. But instead, he's gotten the Baltic states and Scandinavian states and basically every free country within 2,000 miles of Russia to say they want to join NATO. So the strength of NATO looks greater, and Germany now realizes that it can't simply stand back and rely on Russia and rely on the US to provide protection for it. The situation in Japan and South Korea is quite dangerous because North Korean missiles are in the hands of someone who one cannot have a diplomatic conversation with. At the same time, China is increasingly aggressive. The concerns about an invasion of Taiwan are real. I will say, though, that the fact that so many countries, not India, but so many other countries came to the aid of Ukraine probably gives China pause in thinking that it can successfully take and hold on to Taiwan without devastating results. So I think while Taiwan may be in danger because China covets Taiwan in the future, I think the backlash against Putin and Russia is probably a lesson that Mr. Xi is thinking about today.
So I think, if you could also give a little, I mean, what is, we're of course seeing a war that's, or a semi-war or a quasi-war that's happening. But like you correctly said, at the back end, I think there's a proxy war of sorts, with, the US and China kind of positioning and trying to figure out which steps to take forward. So how do you see the US, China relationships pan out? Todd, if you could elaborate a bit on that.
Yes, I think the U.S.-China relationship, I think, is degrading. That is, it's almost ironic that there were books written by prominent scholars not too many years ago about how China and the U.S. were becoming kind of like one country, a partnership, a marriage that was inextricable. And that was based on the idea that so much manufacturing for US companies was being done at fabrication plants in China. Now, what's happened has been a couple things. First of all, China's foreign policy has been something that's been abhorrent to many U.S. politicians. On the Democratic side, Nancy Pelosi has been a vicious critic of China, much more so than the Biden administration. In fact, when I mentioned earlier how embarrassing it was that OPEC has totally ignored Joe Biden, the other embarrassment was a couple months ago when Nancy Pelosi, the head of the House of Representatives, the most prominent Democrat after Joe Biden, went to Taiwan when Joe Biden and his advisors had begged her, don't go, and she ignored them. So the antipathy towards China cuts across both parties. Basically, the two biggest critics in America of China are Donald Trump, a Republican, and Nancy Pelosi, a powerful Democrat. So it's been a kind of bipartisan dislike of China. What we've seen in the last 10 years have been wages in China have gone up very, very quickly, which has made China manufacturing a little less competitive, which has meant that countries like Cambodia, Laos, Mexico, India, others have a greater opportunity to take market share in manufacturing. And then, as I mentioned earlier, even states within the US, in Ohio, and in New York and Georgia and North Carolina and South Carolina have the ability to take market share in manufacturing from China. So there seems to be in the future less need for China. And I think there's also a recognition among many American corporate executives that even though China may be a country with 1 billion consumers, that it's extremely difficult to earn profits, to bring back profits. You might be able to crack into the market, but by the time you have to make a partnership with a Chinese company, and then a partnership with the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, and with local government, that the actual net revenue is not worth the effort. By the way, this was spoken aloud briefly for just a few seconds by the former CEO of General Electric, Jeffrey Immelt. Some years ago was in China, and he said, "We can't make money here." And he said that, and then suddenly the General Electric public relations executives came in and said, "Shh, you can't say that." He had to backtrack and reverse what he said, but that was the truth. And that's increasingly seen that China is not the the golden goose or the goose that lays the golden eggs, but instead it's the Peking duck that may be tasty from time to time, but not something you're going to be able to depend on.
That's nicely put.
I like Peking duck.
Todd, Tanay, we can we take a last question or possibly two quick questions?
Yeah, so there are two questions. One is a segue into domestic policy, and one is domestic policy itself. If I could take the two. So the first is from Nitin Parikh at Hindalco. Um, how will domestic economic policy be used in the new Cold War? Is the stronger USD, are higher interest rates a political weapon? Can they be used, to channel money to friends so that you can friendshore supply chains? Is that also something that's happening?
So actually today I'm sorry, the audio cut out. So to funnel money to
Sorry,
friends.
sorry. No, so if the dollar is expensive and if interest rates are
Uh-huh.
high, then policymakers in the US might be able to funnel money to friends at favorable terms for them to friendshore supply chains or to onshore supply chains. So is that also part of something that's going on? And how do both the parties play into that?
Well, I mean, I don't think. Look, the strong dollar is not something that politicians focus on unless there's a terrible crisis. And so it is, it is a conversation among a limited number of people within Washington, D.C. The question we're going to have is whether countries that have debt denominated in US dollars begin to struggle badly. And if you compare this, for instance, China, as part of its foreign policy, has lent so much money abroad. And we see, I believe, it was Sri Lanka, where I believe it's Sri Lanka, where China took back property because of defaults on Chinese debt. The U.S. does not want to be causing those sorts of issues, but I don't perceive that there's going to be, a kind of debt bailout nationwide. Now, when you talk about domestically and talk about interest rates and the value of the dollar, the the profile of American consumers, the debt profile, actually looks rather stable. Even though interest rates are very high, or sorry, inflation's very high and interest rates have been rising, the financial obligations index, that is, what proportion of monthly family income is used to pay back debt, it's actually a rather modest number. Credit scores for American households are strong at the moment. The amount of cash that families have in the bank is higher now than it was before COVID. So it's hard to see where a debt crisis comes from at the moment. Having said that, the higher interest rate policy is punishing the housing sector. I don't believe it's a matter of people are going to be losing their homes, but I think home builders and home sellers are not going to be able to sell at the prices that they like. And I think the tightening of policy is going to be felt most by housing and automobiles. I think other aspects of the consumer economy will probably hold up as Jay Powell tightens policy, but those two sectors in particular, I think, are going to be victims of the tighter policy. I hope that's responsive.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Thank you. I'll come with the last question now, and we've taken quite a bit of time, so I'll keep it at that. How does fiscal policy look now? So, for a long time, Republicans had a huge distaste for fiscal spending. Democrats liked it, but it's caused lots of inflation now, so they might even uh, not want to go ahead with it. But it might be required in a big way for defense, for infrastructure, for investment into commodities, for new supply chains, and so on. What is the evolving dynamic around that, and how will that impact inflation in people's minds, at least?
Yes, yeah, that's a great question because it was funny. Up until a year or two ago, you had many people talking about MMT, modern monetary theory, and I know you had previously interviewed Otmar Issing, the former Bundesbank chief economist. Otmar and I together took part in a debate about MMT and inflation and fiscal policy, and we debated Stephanie Kelton, who's seen as the dean, the founder of MMT. And I have to tell you, when we held that debate a year and a half ago, MMT was so popular, it was very difficult for Otmar Issing and myself to persuade people that there could be inflation, because she had told everybody there couldn't be inflation. And MMT people say if there is inflation, the answer is to tighten fiscal policy and cut spending. Well, we now have super high levels of inflation, and nobody is suggesting cutting fiscal policy. And I haven't heard Stephanie Kelton come out and say that we should cut lots of policy to fight inflation. So on fiscal policy, the attitude was becoming very, very loose a couple of years ago. Now, among Republicans, the feeling is we need more defense spending. That clearly Vladimir Putin and Mr. Xi in China have demonstrated that with threats to Taiwan, and not just threats, but invasions of Ukraine and Eastern Europe, that the U.S. needs to be better prepared. And our Navy needs to be increasing in size, not shrinking in size, as it seems to be under the Biden administration. So the Republicans will countenance that. On fiscal policy, Republicans always want to talk about tax cuts. And so they will have to devise, in order to maintain their stature as Republicans, they will have to promise some tax cuts. Now, interestingly, you see, Joe Biden has not really been able to recall or cancel the tax cuts significantly that Donald Trump put in place. So basically, to summarize your answer, if you and I were having this conversation a year and a half ago, I would have to tell you that fiscal policy is going to be loose because nobody worries about inflation. Now the situation has changed. There's a little bit more discipline. And you see it in the following. Joe Biden had successfully passed something he called the Inflation Reduction Act, which really was not going to reduce inflation very much. They were going to the government would negotiate new drug prices with pharmaceuticals. There'd be a bit of a corporate tax increase. It was heralded as inflation reduction. It would be modest, but within minutes, it seemed, the Biden administration said it was going to cancel student debt. And independent analysts and now the Congressional Budget Office have said this will blow up the budget deficit by nearly $500 billion, wiping out all of the purported savings of the Inflation Reduction Act. So this wiping out of student debt is unpopular within the Republican Party, but there are many prominent Democrats who criticize the Biden administration for doing this, including my friends Larry Summers and Jason Furman. Jason Furman was chief economist for the Obama administration. So many prominent Democrats think Biden made a big mistake with this looser fiscal policy, but also this seeming giveaway to people who didn't pay back student debt.
I think, Todd, it's been we've stolen you for almost 1.5 hours, kind of extended by about 15-20 minutes. So first of all, thank you. So before I pass on to Tanay, there's so many nuggets of useful information we've picked up. Georgia versus Pennsylvania, so that's what we're all gonna watch out for. You've given us the potential nominees for 2024 apart from Trump. So there's a whole bunch of Republicans that we're going to be closely watching for. I think love the recession versus secession. I think that's something that I think all of us are going to be using, apart from the fact that China's not a golden goose and the Peking duck statement. But we really like the fact that you could also swing between economics and politics. And I think your views on a strong dollar with regard to in endorsing a stronger Biden government and possibly also helping wage the war on inflation might keep the dollar buoyant for some time. And I think you've also elaborated the slight weaknesses in the Biden government, the way they've not been able to manage, OPEC and even Pulaski within their own team. So a lot of takeaways for us, and it's great. It's always great to have you, Todd, with us, and we look forward to having you again, possibly 2024. So thank you so much. Tanay, is there anything else, any customers that you want to just sum up for Todd?
No, nothing at all, Brajesh. Thanks, Todd. Thanks, Brajesh, for your time and for your experience. Let me just deliver the vote of thanks. On behalf of Axis Bank, this concludes the discussion. I would like to take a moment to convey our gratitude to Todd Buckles and Brajesh Jalil for their time and the benefits of their experiences. We look forward to our customers joining us for the next edition of Treasury Market Talks. A recording of this discussion will be available in case you wish to have this passed on to your colleagues. Do connect with your relationship managers for help. Once again, thank you all for joining us. You may now log out from the webinar.
Thank you. Cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you.